Hi, this is Dan Bullard, retired electronics engineer. You might notice how my hair came off. My wife finally cut it because it looks so ratty. That's what COVID will do to you. You know, it's a bad thing. I want to talk about a couple of things along with the Bullard Harmonic Solution. I came to a realization that's really cool. The pattern you see of harmonics, and it turns out to be a humping pattern if you look at it. And it depends on where the distortion is. If the distortion's near the zero crossing or somewhere, then you may not see a humping pattern. You may see something different, but you'll see a pattern of harmonics. That pattern, you know, this could have been solved decades ago, decades. I'm not going to tell you the Bullard Harmonic Solution, but the Bullard Harmonic Solution is basically a rectified cosine wave along with the angle in there somewhere where the distortion happens. And so it's a rectified cosine wave. And the problem is you don't get to see that in a logarithmic scale. In a dB scale, you don't really you can't recognize it. But I recognized it, you know, long ago, that something was going on. It sounds like somebody's coming. Oh yeah, there's a yacht coming. Cool, okay. I recognized that something was going on, you know, when I saw on that spectrum analyzer that I was telling you about my friend Terry Wilson, that he was doing this spectrum, and man, you see something. Now the thing about that is, because it's a cosine wave, it goes to zero, right? What's the log of zero? If you do a amplitude, wow, that's going to be beautiful. Hello. If you do an amplitude plot in logarithmic form on a cosine wave, you'll see when it goes to zero, it drops to like minus 300 and something dB. So that's the reason why the dips are so deep. It's because that thing just drops like a rock. And so what the rest of it kind of looks like circular kind of, but it's actually a cosine wave. But the problem is when that thing drops, man, it drops like a rock. And that explains why if you have, like if there are two, and remember that where it drops doesn't happen necessarily on harmonic. It's totally random. It's based on the angle, the phase angle. So as I mentioned in my other video, if I move that phase angle, that causes those peaks to change in amplitude relative to each other. And if the dip happens right smack in the middle, those two will be equal. If it happens a little bit that way, then this one goes bigger. If it happens a little bit that way, then that one gets bigger. And if it happens a little bit more that way, that one goes to nothing. And I do that in my book, Moron Harmonics for Morons. I show you one of the things that's going all the way negative to zero, basically zero. One of the harmonics goes to zero. And the problem is when things get really close to zero in the real world, you'll get noise there. And even in the FFT, in the digital world, if you just do it pure DSP, you'll see that it doesn't go to zero. It goes very small, but it doesn't go to zero because there's some mathematical noise. And that's one of the differences between in the logarithmic thing, is that it goes way negative. It goes negative 300 dB. And the values down there don't make any sense. The phases don't make any sense. So even though Bullard law of harmonics number 5 is always true, the phase probably doesn't make sense because the level is so low that the mathematical noise of the FFT gets in there. And that's always been a problem. You'll have to look into how that works, but there is mathematical noise behind an FFT. Just all the multiplications and all the additions you have to do in the FFT, it's going to result in some mathematical noise. You just have to get used to that. Now, that's quite a thing to look at when that thing dips way down to minus 300 and something dB. So it only happens at a very specific angle, though, because, like I said, that thing falls somewhere relative to the harmonics. There's no relationship between where that falls and the harmonics, and so it may fall between two harmonics and they end up exactly the same amplitude. It may end up falling a little bit to one side or the other, and so they'll do this, and it depends. It could be much more complicated because of the way things work. So I think that's a boat going by, and somebody's dinging me. It's not your phone, it's mine. Shouldn't wear my phone on making a video. Now, the Bullard Harmonic Solution, I mean, if you really want to know it, you can figure it out. You don't have to like have some, mythical creature just tell you what it is in your sleep, You can get it just by figuring it out, right? Just figure it out. But it's a rectified cosine wave. And it's not related to the harmonics. It doesn't necessarily happen on the harmonics. It just modulates the amplitude of the harmonics. That's the way it works. And that's the God of harmonics, what I call the God of harmonics. Okay. That's one thing I want to talk about. Another thing I want to talk about is, I talk about my successes here all the time, but occasionally I have failures. And I want to tell you about one failure that I had when I was in, it was terrible. I was in Taiwan. I had to fly, they asked me to fly to Korea, South Korea, to talk to Philips over there. I had done a lot of work for Philips in the US anyway, so I flew from Taiwan to Korea and went and talked to these guys about testing their devices on an STS 3000, STS 3000. And they said, okay, well, looks good, so we'll see you in a week. We're coming to the States for training. I'm like, what? So these guys decided they're going to buy a tester. They wanted to go to the States. They wanted to go to Oregon. They wanted me to train them. And then they wanted me to write all their test programs. They had like 4 test programs they wanted me to do. And so, oh God. So I couldn't even, believe it or not, I was in South Korea and my plane was going to leave, my plane that I had planned on flying was going to leave from Taiwan to South Korea and then to the US. So I called the airline and I said, hey, can I just get on when it gets to Korea? And they said, no, if you're not on there in Taiwan, we're going to give your seat away. So I said, okay, fine. I canceled that flight and I got another flight out. And it was terrible. So I got home, barely had a week to get ready for these Koreans to come and visit. So when they came, I got them a rental car, I got them an apartment, I had everything set up for them. That's the kind of things that I do, And so it was tough. They wanted to do all kinds of things in the U.S., but they still wanted to be Korean, so they still wanted to eat roasted squid on their electric stove. They would take a dead squid, basically raw squid, and turn on the burner, get it red hot on their stove, and then drop that thing on the stove. It just stunk like hell. And they had an apartment. I got them an apartment that didn't have an exhaust fan that went outside. It just blew the air around in the house. So it just stunk like hell. But anyway, so I went to South Korea. I had to go to South Korea with these guys to do this job for them. And I only had like 2 of the programs done, which was bad. A comparator and a op amp. And so when I went to Korea, I was going to have to write 2 more test programs. And so luckily I got a first class upgrade though, so I got to fly first class. That was great. Looking down at the Aleutian Islands while I'm eating caviar and drinking champagne. That was freaking great. So anyway, so I got to Korea and everything went downhill from there. And the Koreans just treated me like shit. I mean, they you're a white guy, you're a monkey, you don't matter, you know. And they would talk to each other in Korean, and while I was standing there and just ignoring me, and then eventually they'd say, okay, we want you to do this. It was terrible. It was terrible. It was like close to what the guys in Vietnam went through with the gun against the head and shit. I mean, it was like that. It was really bad. And along the way, I got the op amp and the comparator program working, and I did another program, and I did this third program for it was a wireless remote control receiver, and it had some noise measurement down in the minus 60 dB range, and it didn't work very good. And I didn't know what the problem was, and I struggled with it and struggled with it and struggled with it, and I couldn't get it to work. And now after 2.5 weeks, I got an email from my boss. He wanted me to go to Japan to look at this other problem. And I said, well, I'm tied up with these South Koreans. And he says, well, can you try to get to Japan for the weekend? I'm like, I'll ask them. So I asked the Koreans, and they said, okay, but you have to stay another week. So they would let me go to Japan and work on this problem and come back to South Korea, and I'd have to stay there another week, which meant I would spend Easter in South Korea, which sucked. So I was working on it like crazy. I was killing myself. Oh my God. You should read about it in my book. It was terrible. So anyway, I got the program kind of working, but it wasn't working very good. And it turned out that I asked them to, you know, they said they would call the airport to make sure that I was going to be okay to leave on Friday. Well, they didn't. And so I called myself, and they said, oh no, you're not confirmed. I said, well, confirm me now. And they said, I'm sorry, we can't do that. We don't have room on the plane. So I'm like, oh my God. So I had to get a flight to Hawaii, from South Korea all the way to Hawaii, and then Hawaii to Portland. And that was a long, long, long way to go. But the Koreans were surprised that I was leaving. They thought they'd found a way to keep me there, but I worked around it. So I was able to get out of there and fly back to the States, and I swore I'd never go back again. They treated me so bad. But then, like a year later, I still hadn't really solved the problem. A year later, my boss said, okay, look, they're really insisting that you come over there. And I said, okay, I'll go over there, but I mean, no changes in my flights. I go over for 2 weeks and I come back. No changes, no nothing. So I went over there with a new load board, redesigned. I put everything I had into it. Still wasn't working. So I was there for 2 weeks, and at the end, the employees at the South Korean Phillips plant threw a strike. They had a strike, and they were going to commit violence. And so they, these guys that I was working with, they actually asked me to help them. They said, forget about the test program. They wanted me to help them shove testers up against the doors and all kinds of cardboard boxes and stuff up against doors so people couldn't break in. It was crazy. It was crazy. And the operators were just throwing a strike, and so finally I got it working pretty good. And my boss said, or the guy there said, okay, you need to go now because they're going to storm the buildings. So I'm like, okay, fine, I'll get out of here. So I did. I took a taxi back, and I got on a plane, and I went home. And I went back to Portland, and I swore I'd never go to Korea again because they treated me so bad. They really treated me terrible. But not for good reason. I mean, not because it wasn't a good reason. I couldn't pull this thing off, this remote control thing. Turns out I didn't take into account sine x over x. So many months later, I figured out what I had done wrong. It wasn't something I did wrong, I just didn't account for sine x over x. The tester that they were using was like a Teradyne A3 something, and it had like a much higher sample rate on the AWG than the Credence STS 3000. So because their sample rate was higher, that means that they attenuated the signal less, so you really didn't need much sin X over X correction. But because the STS 3000 couldn't go that fast, that meant that sin X over X was going to start impacting that signal. And so it couldn't perform. It just couldn't do it. And so I learned all about sin X over X. I mean, what's the punishment for not learning sin X over X? An all-expense paid trip to Korea. And they'll keep you there as long as they want, as long as they can find a way to keep you there. And I mean, after that, I would sometimes take those same flights from Portland to Taiwan with a stopover in South Korea, and I would pray to God that I wouldn't see those fucking guys from Phillips in the airport hanging around waiting to see if Dan Bullard showed up. It was scary. But, you know, and then afterwards I became marketing manager or marketing engineer. And so then I had to go to Korea, and I don't like Koreans. I just don't like Koreans. I'm sorry. And I've showered with Koreans. They have little dicks, okay? That's just the way it is. They just have little dicks. It's like, how do you find that? You know, how does your wife find that? In fact, in Korea, in South Korea, this is true. Friday isn't the big celebration day because you don't necessarily get Saturday off. Normally you work half a day Saturday. And so Friday night you don't party too much. You go to work on Saturday morning, you work for half a day, and then you're off until Monday. So the only time, apparently in South Korea, the only time that husbands and wives can have sex is Saturday night. That's the way it is. It's just a weird place, you know. I mean, all the electronic stuff I learned was pretty interesting, but all the cultural stuff I learned was quite serious. And I mean, these guys, it's a different world, okay? China, Korea, Japan was fairly civilized. Japan was actually pretty nice. I was only there for a day, and I flew in, looked at the problem, couldn't figure it out. The guy says, okay, well, you'll be here tomorrow, right? And I said, no, I'm leaving tomorrow. I had a taxi driver all lined up to take me back to the airport the day after. And I swore that I would be there, and she swore that she would be there to pick me up. This was 2 hours from Tokyo. So she had to drive 2 hours to pick me up and take me back to Tokyo. So I wasn't going to miss that. I mean, I definitely wasn't going to miss that. I wasn't going to. And what was my reward? Leaving Japan to go to South Korea. Ugh. But the good news is I met in the airport lounge, I met the CEO of Sanger Boats. Now, Sanger Boats, big deal. No, my mother was from Sanger. So Sanger Boats was like a big deal in Southern California, around Fresno, because I was around Sanger and all the lakes that are out there, and they just do go-fast boats, a lot of water skiing and stuff. So all my relatives are from Fresno. That's why Fresno has a major thoroughfare called Bullard. Okay, but I met this guy in the airport lounge, and he's the CEO of Sanger Boats. I'm like, what are you doing here? And he's like, I'm doing a water ski tournament, or a water ski exposition. So they were going up and down the river, in that filthy river, and showing off water skiing. It's crazy. But anyway, that was one good thing that came out of that whole trip. But I don't ever want to go back to South Korea. I want nothing to do with South Korea. I'm glad that people are escaping North Korea, and they're happy. They're welcome to go to South Korea. They're not welcome to come here. I don't want them here. Anyway, yeah, call me racist, but I don't care. They treated me bad. They really treated me bad. So anyway, from the river, this is Dan Bullard. See you later.